today's seminar hosted by the Transnational Legal History Group, part of the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law here at CUHK Law. Our presenter today is Selda Altan, Assistant Professor in the Department of History at Randolph College in the United States. Professor Altan will speak today on the subject of her new book, Chinese Workers of the World. In it, Professor Altan focuses on in particular, on the construction of a railway linking French-controlled Vietnam, Indochina to Yunnan province in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And through that central focus, explores struggles over the nature of colonialism and anti-colonialism, attempts to obtain commercial profits, to expand control, workers' exploitation and resistance, among many other themes, as I'm sure she will go into much more eloquently and in much greater depth very soon. And, I encourage everyone very, very strongly to pick up a copy, read the book. It's incredibly interesting. It has it brings together so many different themes from so many different angles, so many familiar but also surprising stories to those with some familiarity in these areas, and also is incredibly well written. It was a very enjoyable read. So I encourage everyone to pick it up. So Professor Altan will speak for about 40 minutes today. After that, we will open the floor to questions and discussions. So please feel free, as always, to send me a message in the chat during the talk if there's anything you would like to ask. And you can either write out your question if you would rather that I read it, or request that I unmute you so you can ask your question directly. And for everyone's information as well, this talk today will be recorded and posted online after the event. So if you want to review some of the content or share it with others, you're always free to find it on our website. So without further ado, let me hand over the floor to Professor Altan.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for the invitation and also for all the arrangements. Okay, so again, I would like to repeat my thanks. It's wonderful to be here, though I have to admit it's a little bit scary speaking to a legal studies group here. But Christopher was telling me there are people from other fields as well. So hopefully everyone will find something related to their own interest areas. So the book was published in June, so it's been a couple of months now since I have the physical copy. And I've been reading it myself too, and every time I reread, I enjoy. And unfortunately, of course, I discover some mistakes. And once you write the book, you cannot stop thinking about it. I still think about it. I still think about Chinese labor history, and I still think about it from a global perspective. I still work on papers and publications about it. So this is still an ongoing project for me. So I would like to start by talking about how I became interested in this subject. And then I will go more into details. Especially, I would like to talk about what type of contributions or interventions the book does in the literature. So I grew up in Istanbul. I'm originally from Turkey. I grew up in Istanbul in a working class neighborhood. So labor was something quite natural to me. I mean, it's almost in my genes. So there's nothing surprising that I became a labor historian. But I became interested in specifically this topic when I was writing my master's thesis in China. So for my master's thesis, I was working on Chinese-Ottoman interactions in the early 20th century. And I got the Chinese government scholarship. I was doing research in Chinese archives and libraries. Of course, archive access is always an issue in China, but I was able to read publications, from contemporary press in the early 20th century. So, of course, I was looking for Chinese-Ottoman interactions, but diplomatic relations between those two empires were very limited. So I was looking at specifically individuals who created some type of connection between these two empires. And then I found a newspaper piece talking about Ottoman workers employed on a railway built between Yunnan and Vietnam. And I found it really interesting because at the time, of course, my understanding of China was, I should say, limited. And I thought that, why people from the Ottoman Empire went to China to work on a railway, because China was full of laborers. And our image of China is a place of abundant labor and cheap labor. And the story I found contradicted my perceptions at the time. Then, it was just a moment and it inspired me, or it made me curious. And when I started working on my PhD, I realized that indeed there was not enough publications on this railway, because I was still looking for more information and for the reasons of why this labor migration from Europe, Middle East to China. Then I decided to make this my dissertation topic. And as I worked on the topic, of course, I realized that indeed Yunnan was a distinct province. It did not carry the characteristics of China that we know from the East Coast regions of China. Of course, much of my information about China at the time was coming from books about Shanghai, Beijing, a lot of international relations perspective. So I did not have a good grasp of the particularities of Yunnan. Then, as I worked on this topic, I realized that indeed Yunnan was not did not have a dense population. Indeed, it was sparsely populated, and many of the people living in Yunnan were indigenous populations living in mountainous areas, especially in southern parts of the province, and the area was a very difficult region. So here on this map, you can see I'm talking about Yunnan province. Of course, I guess everyone in the audience is familiar with the map of China. So this border province is just next to Tonkin, and by the time railway was built, French had consolidated its colonial power, unified Vietnam as a colonial territory, and looking for further expansion into China. And Yunnan Railways was part of the story. But of course, it was a profitable or promising colonial venture as they thought about it, because Yunnan was one of the two opium producing provinces of China. And it had good connection to Southeast Asia. And then Sichuan was also a good market. So they had really high expectations, but once the actual construction started, they realized that indeed the region was particularly difficult because of the topography. It was a mountainous area, and more importantly, it had a malarial climate. And also, population was sparse, and the locals and indigenous populations were not willing to work for the railway. So it was a new reality, because just as I did, they also thought that China was full of cheap laborers, and they would be easily complete this railway, but it was not the reality. So immediately after they started the construction, they realized that there was a major resistance to any type of foreign expansion, including mining investments in the region. But then there was a major labor shortage. That's why they started to recruit workers from other Chinese provinces. And then, once I started learning about that story, it became quite interesting. So here again, you see some images, and I think these images are enough to demonstrate how difficult it was to build this railway. And again, of course, at the time, French engineers or French people, politicians, everyone was very proud of the project, because it's immediately after they built the Eiffel Tower. They were using, advanced engineering techniques. So they thought that this was the pinnacle of French engineering and modern technologies. But when they completed the railway in 1910, and you see the images here from the celebration, from the opening ceremony, at least 12,000 workers had died. So definitely it was a very tragic event, but still, of course, many people participated in the ceremony. We're talking about what a great achievement this was for the French Empire. So what made this story so interesting was the labor conflicts and struggles during the process. Indeed, when I searched the literature, there's not a big mention of labor question during the construction. In Chinese historiography and in French historiography, they usually focus on the difficulty of the project, international relations aspect, and the perspectives change over time, as we expect in any type of history writing. But in this case in particular, the mention of labor was very limited. But indeed, I think from my perspective, it was the main issue. So what the French did to solve the labor shortage problem was to recruit workers from other Chinese provinces, because this was definitely a shocking experience for them. This was not the expectation. And when they started recruiting workers, they used a system called the coolie trade. So coolie trade, by the way, I'll be using coolie as a term to explain this situation here, but I'm aware that indeed, it is used in some derogatory senses. So I apologize if I, cause any discomfort here among the audience, but I use it to provide a historical explanation here. So coolies were Chinese workers, and they were considered to be unskilled manual labor, and they are contract laborers. So in the early 19th century, different colonial powers, Britain, definitely the leading force of this trade, and France and even Dutch colonists, different colonial powers, they started to hire Asian labor from India, from China, or other, East Asian and Southeast Asian countries, because this was the post-slavery, post-emancipation period. There was a massive need for labor, and Asian laborers seemed to be a good option. Unfortunately, the coolie trade was quite notorious because even if it was considered to be a transition to wage labor, because it was considered to be free in a sense, still workers were signing contracts, and these contracts entailed some kind of penalty in case workers violated the terms of these contracts. So they were legally binding. And the other issue was that once workers left their hometowns, their country, then they were usually unprotected, and they were subject to rules and regulations in those colonial territories wherever they were employed. So it was a system of indenture in a way. And I realized that the French company was doing recruitment based on the same model of the coolie trade. So what they did, they went to southern provinces of China, where individual companies, some of them were foreign companies, were recruiting for overseas colonial projects. So they used the same structure, and they prepared contracts and signed contracts with workers in those provinces. I have some examples here. Indeed, coolie trade has been studied extensively by scholars, and all of these examples are excellent scholarship. I do not put them here just to criticize, but my book brings this new perspective, making this connection between the overseas, international, or global coolie trade and class formation in China. So what I try to say here, these examples are perfect examples of, coolie studies. And then there is another literature on class formation or labor movements in China. Again, these are best examples of that literature. And my book is trying to connect these two different literatures through the case of Yunnan Indochina Railway workers. So when I, look at this labor recruitment process, what I saw was this connection between the overseas coolie trade and its impact on labor movements. I mean, it's hard to say there was a labor movement in this time period, but it was obvious that people, Chinese workers, had a sense of what was going on in global markets, and they used this information to leverage their position in the Chinese market. So what I'm saying here in this book is that indeed by the early 20th century, colonial powers had created a free labor market in China through indeed colonial enforcement. They signed unequal treaties and liberated Chinese workers from the control of the Qing central government, created this free market, and they started to recruit workers in this free market. Of course, I use quotation marks here because, again, they are signing contracts, they have a binding nature, and mostly to the advantage of the employers. So this is, I think, the first intervention of the book. And the second intervention of the book is the racialization of Chinese labor. I need to check my time, by the way. So when I connect these two stories, what's happening in Chinese labor market and, what type of consciousness Chinese workers are developing in this time period, based on this global experience of Gulf trade. Of course, I was using the information about Chinese exclusion or the discourse on the yellow peril in the world. So what I found, again, when I looked at those cases, labor conflicts during the construction of the Yunnan Railway, I realized that the foreign employers of the French company, of course, I should say many of these foreign employers were Italians, by the way, because there were not enough French contractors willing to come to this difficult geography and invest in this area. So it was mostly Italian contractors, and one of the main investors was a person of Greek origin who earlier built the Ottoman Railway. So I think they were a type of global network traveling in different parts of the world and building railways and creating these infrastructures. So they are private companies looking for profit in different locations. So, I mean, the railway company or its contractors had a very, multinational, complex structure. But when I looked at their attitudes toward the laborers, I realized that indeed they had this racial bias. Of course, there's nothing surprising about this, but again, this made me think about the global context at the time. So when they were recruiting workers, Chinese workers for this railway, indeed, those employers had these notions these notions of Chinese racial identity. So racialization of Chinese labor had already happening in different parts of the world, in particular the United States, because coolie trade became so problematic that American politicians made it a major part of their political campaigns, arguing that coolie labor was a new form of slavery. And it's as if Chinese were trying to, integrate themselves into the system voluntarily, and blaming Chinese people for being slaves or having this slave mentality. So anti-Chinese discourse was spread everywhere, but I think the main location was definitely the United States. But then in other parts, in other parts of the world, in South Africa, in Australia, there was this major movement against Chinese immigration, but in particular, the immigration of Chinese workers. Indeed, if you look at those exclusion laws, you will see merchants, students, business people, these people, diplomats were left outside of these categories, whereas Chinese workers were the main target of exclusion laws. And again, if you look at this picture, you see many American politicians, they argued that indeed they are in favor of exclusion laws in defense of American labor to protect working classes in the United States. So that discourse was already everywhere, and there was that idea that racialization of Chinese labor in a way that it really made it difficult for Chinese workers to survive this anti-Chinese discourse. But still, I think paradoxically, This discourse was giving them, again, a particular mindset, informing them about creating their identity as workers. I think this anti-Chinese discourse, again, this is something I would like to argue in the book, is that, this anti-Chinese discourse informed their identity as a laboring class, serving not only to their own country, to the bourgeoisie in their country, but then the world bourgeoisie in a general sense. So I think this experience, and Chinese workers were employed everywhere in the world at the time. They went to Cuba, Peru, South Africa, Australia. In some cases, they had contract labor contracts. In many instances, they were working side by side with enslaved people. They were employed on some islands in the Indian Ocean. So they were recruited for all sorts of colonial projects in different parts of the world. And this entailed that racialized discourse. When I look at, from this global perspective, when I approach the Yunnan Railway, then I saw the same discourse and same mentality at work. But in Yunnan, of course, there were more maybe subtle ways of doing this. And the three things I found where I was able to see that racialization or racist discourse in most explicit forms was the practice of medicine, consular jurisdiction and tribunal cases, and also punishment and prison systems. So French, of course, when they had to deal with the difficulty of the region, they had to create a medical establishment in Yunnan. Of course, this was part of their colonial project as well, but they needed to also keep the working population healthy and alive, because many of those recruits, as soon as they arrived at the work site, they were losing their lives immediately. So that became an issue. So they had to invest in medical facilities. But all these doctor reports and those daily encounters indicated a racial conflict and racial bias, especially towards native or local people. Another issue was the judiciary. As I said, many of the employees of the railway were Italians, and they were not subject to any kind of rule or regulation, because Italy at the time did not have a diplomatic treaty with China. So they were under the protection of French consulate, but still their position in this legal system, France, of course, had the extraterritorial rights, but Italians, indeed, they did not have those extraterritorial rights. But de facto, of course, they were benefiting from that. But because of that ambiguity of their status, they were acting more freely, and they were becoming more abusive toward workers. And I had so many cases of, Italian contractors or, other employees killing Chinese workers with no punishment at all. And the issue, again, another argument I try to make here is that there were all sorts of daily conflicts between those laborers and their employers. And Europeans tended to see Chinese workers and their reactions to their foreign employers as cultural characteristics. Again, they were culturalizing the issue or racializing the issue instead of seeing them as a labor resistance in a European sense. Indeed, many of these conflicts were originating from the fact that the workers were not paid, they were not given enough food, clothing, or their circumstances were not good. So they were resisting in ways possible. But then French diplomats or European employers were criminalizing those actions and refusing to see them as proper actions in proper labor actions or class struggles in a European sense. I think this refusal of recognizing them as workers was part of this racial discourse, widespread and global at the time. Again, when there were reactions to foreign investments in the region, foreigners were coming together easily and defending themselves and taking action together. And I was reading a lot of individual memoirs, and in those accounts, again, I can easily see that foreigners had that superiority complex toward those indigenous populations, always complaining about sanitary circumstances and similar issues. Again, another part of the story is the punishments. They created prisons because, again, once you criminalize every action, instead of dealing with them in a proper sense, as if you are dealing with a labor strike or anything like that, they were investing more in prison and punishment system. And when they were implementing those punishments, again, they were taking that culturalist attitude, and they were assuming that, oh, many of those things are, or punishments, especially physical punishment, was normalized. And those Europeans were easily killing the workers and then easily escaping either to Hanoi, to Vietnam, or in many instances, they were not getting enough punishments, but still complaining about how Chinese were the guilty ones. So again, this is the second argument of the book, I should say, the fact that Chinese workers, coolies in this sense, in this case, were not recognized as workers in a European sense, and this is related to the racialization of workers. So then I was thinking about what Chinese people or diplomats or officials, what they did or how they reacted to this tragedy, because it was obvious that there was a tragedy going on. Thousands of workers were losing their lives. They were getting sick. They were not paid properly. There were all sorts of conflicts. And this is definitely a interesting time period in Chinese history where we had nationalist activism, and Sun Yat-sen, figures like Sun Yat-sen are very prominent and developing an anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and anti-imperialist discourse and propaganda. So initially, of course, my intention was to go to Yunnan archives. Of course, I went to Yunnan archives, but they did not let me use the collection. They digitized collections after 1912, but the documents I needed was from the late Qing period, and at the time, late Qing collection was not open to researchers, but they published some documents from the archive, so I was able to use it. But my main source for the Chinese perspective was this journal you see here in this image, is the Yunnan Journal. So this was published by Tongmeng Hui, the Revolutionary Alliance led by Sun Yat-sen, and indeed Sun Yat-sen took initiative for the publication of this journal, and they negotiated with a local nationalist revolutionary, and they started publishing this journal in 1906. And this journal included some reports about conflicts on the railway. So I don't want to go into the details. Definitely we don't have enough time to have a big discussion about how Chinese nationalists framed the issue or discussed the issue. I think they had their own understanding of political economy and, how to create a new nation out of an empire. And economy was definitely key. And they were thinking about Yunnan seriously. And Yunnan's economy seriously. But when it came to workers, I think their approach was not so different from the European employers of the employees and employers of the railway company. I'm not saying this, they were abusive or anything towards workers, but similarly, they did not recognize Chinese coolies as workers in the sense we understand today. Because, from a nationalist perspective, a good citizen would be someone with some kind of maybe capital, an ability to investment, or someone with a good education, or the main expectation is to have some level of national consciousness. And when Chinese nationalists look at the workers, that was not what they expected to see. They did not, of course, they organized an uprising in 1908, but this was not against the French railway company. Indeed, when I read the documents, it seems like Chinese historiography depicts this 1908 CUHK LAW rebellion as a rebellion against foreigners and French railway. But my understanding is that indeed it was a rebellion led by, again, revolutionary allies against the Manchu government. So this was a nationalist, and it's one of the rebellions in a chain of rebellions, and it was unsuccessful and short-lived, and the worker participation in the rebellion was very limited, but still, of course, there was some participation, and they used Vietnam as a base. But the rebellion was problematic in many ways because of the demography of the leaders, etc. But again, what I try to say here is that from their perspectives, definitely the treatment of Chinese workers by their foreign employers was not acceptable. They criticized it through their reports in the journal, and they criticized the government for not protecting workers properly. But at the same time, they did not see Chinese workers in this case as the agents of a revolutionary struggle, and they did not see them as workers, again, in the European sense, because, as I said, they were expecting to see some kind of educated classes in their struggle, and they were in support of the development of a bourgeois class, for sure, because they thought that that's how you build a nation. So, for example, you have this figure, Li Yuan here, a nationalist leader. Later, he will be a very influential figure in the history of the province. But again, they did not think that class struggle was a priority for China at the time, and they aimed to work against the Manchu government and overthrow it, and then create some kind of autonomous rule in Yunnan for future unification of the country. Officials, at the same time, they were part of the story, and they were indeed working actively to protect the interests of the workers. At the time, China did not have a labor law, but in many of the international relations signed with those, colonial powers, you will see some clauses indicating that, there's an expectation for fair treatment of workers, and Yunnan Railway Treaty was similar, and officials were in charge of protecting the workers. And Sun Chun-shuan, for example, the governor of Guangdong and these, Guangxi, those provinces, indeed, at some point, he banned recruitment for the Yunnan Railway because of the mistreatment of workers. So indeed, Chinese officials were taking initiative and trying to protect the workers against those foreigners. Again, of course, this is not in the expectation that they would, they were interested in social stability and peace, etc. They did not want an actual conflict in their localities. So indeed, again, here, what I try to say is that Chinese workers at the time were in constant struggle against their employers, and they sometimes in those southern provinces where there was a system of coolie recruitment, they were aware of what was going on in the global labor market. They were aware of the demand for their labor, and they used their position, they leveraged their position to negotiate better terms. So when I look at the recruitment processes, I realized that indeed the French company had to improve their contract terms to entice more workers in those provinces to deal with these Chinese officials. So this tells me that indeed that coolie trade, coolie experience in the 19th century informed Chinese workers, domestic Chinese workers, or whoever stayed in China, to be more demanding and to create a notion of what is an acceptable contract, what should be an ideal workplace. So they developed these notions, and they struggled for these interests in maybe not conventional ways, but they never hesitate to, for example, kill their employers if they were not paid. They took that stance and they resisted their employers if necessary, or if they found it appropriate, they joined the nationalist revolutionary cause. As I said, some of the workers in 1908, they joined the rebellion, and many of them were already affiliated with Tongmenghui, and they eventually built the railway. But again, the point I would like to make here is that there was that global situation. Even in a small locality like Yunnan in China, Chinese workers recruited as coolies. They were aware of that global situation, and they shaped their struggles based on that experience, based that on knowledge, and use all the tools available to them to leverage their position. And they were successful to a large extent, as I see in my research. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Selda, for that truly fantastic talk. I'm sure, everybody's forcibly muted in the Zoom, or I'm sure you would hear the ovation currently. And as I'm sure, everyone in the audience, like me, will have heard how much richness and how many fantastic, interesting themes there are that come out of your work. So again, my invitation to everybody to pick up the book. It's very, as I said, it's sort of very, very readable. It has so many interesting issues. So if I think this brief time we have today won't do justice to everything, but you can always, of course, find out more there. So let me encourage everyone again to, if you are able to formulate your question into a text, you can send that to me and I can potentially pose it directly, or you can just let me know, use the raise hand function or send me a message if you would like to pose a question directly yourself. But I have some questions already, and I will take the traditional moderator's privilege to pose a couple myself first, perhaps. So, and these, again, there's sort of so many different angles and sides to this. So I guess these relate to the French colonial side in particular. And on the one hand, in the first place, and I suppose this just relates to some issues I've been thinking about in British Empire history recently. But when you see sort of, when this project sort of got started and as it went along, to what extent would you say it was sort of official French political colonial interests and powers that were driving along the railway project versus to what extent the commercial interests of the different forms, the different actors and so on, like sort of who was in the driving seats through that process. And maybe a second different question, just, as you noted, right, 12,000 workers die. This is, I know there's this later railway construction project in the Congo, but it's a little bit later than this period that does start to get in the French Congo that does start to get criticized. We have already, this is sort of the time period where Belgian Congo is coming heavily under criticism. But my sense is this particular project, the railway project, wasn't that heavily picked up in kind of the international humanitarian press or whatever. But if you could say something about what, to what extent was there international recognition that perhaps there might be some serious abuses here?
Thank you. Great questions. Indeed, I've been thinking about colonialism for so many years. I mean, since my undergrad years, I was always interested in those questions of imperialism and colonialism. And working on this project indeed changed my perspective on the issue, because from my, perspective of youth, I always thought of colonialism as a very linear, straightforward project and always, achieving its goal of exploitation. That was my initial understanding. When I started working on this project, I realized that it was not that straightforward. And as we see in this case, even if they built the railway, all these colonial ventures were not always successful in the way, I mean, of course, I'm saying successful in the way expected by their initiators. So, for example, they initiated this railway with high expectations, but then when it came to the end, they realized that they were in a financial disaster. And then, they found themselves, I mean, maybe they profited, from the railway operations, but overall, it caused so much trouble to the French Empire. So it was, in a way, it's a misadventure, or it was a tragedy, whatever, I mean, you want to call it. It was not a very straightforward, successful project because it revealed so much of the vulnerability of the French Empire. Because again, when I look at this project, from the very beginning, there was no agreement among French colonists about, whether they should build this, because, Britain was also considering building a railway in this province, and they very early on they decided not to build anything because they thought that this would be too difficult. And so many French investors, business people, they were not so eager about this project. Indeed, it was a group of merchants and explorers working in that region, and I think they were looking for new opportunities for themselves. They convinced the metropolitan center to invest in this project, and they were able to do this only when Paul Doumer became the new governor of Indochina, and he had his own vision about colonial development. He was a very ambitious man, and only under his supervision they were able to build this. But even then, again, many French business people, they were not eager to invest in this project, so they used those other contractor companies of different nationalities, and towards the end, they were complaining that it was the Italians benefiting from the project more than the French themselves. So I think this is one of those cases where you see all the contradictions of these colonial projects. Definitely, there was not an ideological consensus about colonial expansion in France. Britain, for example, I think for Britain, I don't know, of course, I don't want to make big statements, maybe you know better, but they seem more straightforward in their commitment to free trade and, expansion. Whereas in France, there was this strong vein of protectionism, and there was that opposition to colonial expansion because they thought that it was expensive and it was creating unfair competition to the metropolitan center. So there was that resistance against colonial expansion because they thought that it was simply expensive. So I think this project became again one of those points of contention, and there were all sorts of debates. Again, only after Doumer came to power and he restructured the colonial economy in Vietnam, then people became convinced that, okay, we can maybe get something from this. But even after that, this was again not a very profitable project for the French Empire. I think there is a great similarity to Congo. First of all, the same railway company contractor company built the two railways. So Congo and yes, indeed, this experience informed their experience there, but unfortunately, the brutality or, the ignorance and negligence of workers' safety, everything was similarly ignored. All those things were very similar. I think, yes, maybe Congo is better known. I think it might be related to Yunnan's peripheral place in the Chinese Empire. As I said, those explorers, they always created that Yunnan myth as if, Yunnan was a very prosperous province with, silk, opium, tea, all the, and tin, of course, minerals were very significant. But overall, Yunnan was an impoverished province with a very sparse population, mostly populated by indigenous populations. It was a very, backward place in terms of its economic development. But still, I should say there were great reactions to the tragedy on the railway. I found many protests and signs in other parts of China, on the East Coast, in southern parts of China, International newspapers were writing about this railway a lot because, this was a matter of competition between France and Britain at the same time. Many British agents were initially concerned that French could really benefit from this. So there was that anxiety. But at the same time, German or other English, especially missionaries, were criticizing employers of the railway for their brutality, mistreatment of workers. So they criticized French mission civilisatrice for not indeed doing its proper job. But it was, again, an inter-imperialist conversation. And they were claiming, we are better in doing this. That type of language was very common. So I think at the time, the Yunnan Railway was definitely a significant thing because it was situated in the middle of this global labor recruitment and infrastructure building system. But later, I think it was mostly forgotten because, no one wanted to remember it.
Well, hopefully it will be less forgotten in future, thanks to
Yes, yeah. That's my hope.
And on the British Empire point, I actually think, I would say something very similar to what you said, which is that, going in, I had one impression, but the more you go into it, the more specifically the, commercial interests often seem to precede and drive things. The official colonial office position, the colonial office is a bit more worried and actually tends to get involved following reports of abuses, that sort of thing, and is much more cautious and careful and uncomfortable with the whole situation. So probably, sort of similar. We all kind of have one imagination, and the more time we spend, I think it trends in the other direction. I would say similarly across the two empires.
Yeah, there were so many disagreements and conflicts within those imperial structures. Yeah.
So let me give the floor to my colleague, Professor Yuming Yan, who I'll just unmute her via the system.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Selda. Thank you so much. I'm actually an assistant professor here at CUHK Law, and I also work labor rights. So my focus is on the labor rights and labor provisions in the international economic agreement. So I find your presentation amazing. I'm a Chinese. I don't really know that history. Great, very amazing talk. So I actually have two questions. So for the first question is about how you define those Chinese laborers in building those Yunnan railways, because in your book, you use Chinese workers, but from your introduction, from a certain perspective, I feel like they are more like slaves, if you can say that. So I was wondering how the international communities define or categorize those Chinese laborers. Is it something it's actually a slave or something between? So that was my first question. And my second question is that, so you mentioned that previously the government did not really engage in or intervene in this kind of relationship, but at a later point they do, intervene. So I was wondering, what is the main driving forces that drives, this government to really engage or intervene in this kind of relationship? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Excellent questions again. Yes, indeed, I think there's a problem that I need to solve in this text. As I said, I tried to get more Chinese sources, but my access to Chinese archives, especially to government perspectives, was very limited. So what I did for this project, I learned French and I used sources from the French archives. So a lot of information in the book is coming from the perspective of the French. Of course, I was trying to read them, in a reverse fashion to understand what I can get about the laborers, even if it was a French narrative. So indeed, that was what exactly the problem for me. Definitely these Europeans had this racialized notion of Chinese workers. From their perspective, white workers or Euro-American workers were a class to be protected against those Chinese workers whom they deemed as enslaved people, slaves. They did not have any freedom because they were living under a monarchic, Qing Empire. They were living in communities. There were some, maybe you know about it, 6 companies, for example, companies dealing recruitment processes and supervising those contract signing and helping workers find money to go to different locations. And in the case of the United States, I think, it was not exactly the coolie trade. Indeed, many Chinese workers were going to United States out of free will, and they, of course, they were in debt to do those things, but they were not like, for example, the coolies recruited for Cuba or Peru, So from a European perspective, they were not workers, and that's definitely my main point, right? These workers were racialized because recognizing Chinese coolies as workers would imply other things, right? Seeing them as equal to European workers, white workers, would mean you would be paying them on equal terms. You will be giving them higher wages. You would be offering similarly good terms. I mean, of course, good in quotation marks here. And then you cannot benefit from the conflict you create between your white working classes versus those Chinese workers. So here, indeed, my argument is informed by the perspective of Cedric Robinson, his discussion of racial capitalism. So he says that capitalism is inherently a racist and racial system. By creating these racial categories, capitalism creates systems of cheap labor and better exploitation. So I was inspired by that perspective, and I argue that indeed European, capitalist classes were using that racist discourse so that they could create the market for cheap labor. Because again, this is the post-emancipation world. Slavery is not available. Indeed, slave labor is quite expensive at this point, even if it was practiced anywhere. So I think from my perspective, indeed, I would like to make that argument that Chinese workers were not slaves, as those people considered, because, as I said, they had systems and mechanisms to protect their interests. They used those labor networks internationally to protect their rights. Those networks provided funeral services. Those networks provided credits and, loans to those people. They provided shelter and housing. All those things were handled by these networks. And they knew about the Chinese workers in other parts of the world. There was that communication between those groups, between China and those immigrant communities. So my argument indeed is that information made it possible for Chinese workers to define themselves as Chinese workers, and they were Chinese workers of the world, the global bourgeoisie, not only of China. So they became a global working class in this unique situation of colonial competition for cheap labor. I think government intervention is, again, an interesting story. Initially, Qing legal system, they banned foreign travel for their subjects, but still people were traveling abroad, especially immigration to Southeast Asia was very popular. And then at some point, governments started to sign contracts with foreign governments for the recruitment of coolies to places like Peru and Cuba. And then at some point, they realized that indeed those workers were sending their money back home. So first of all, there was material benefit coming from the employment of workers in different colonial territories. And second, they started to realize that indeed Chinese workers in different parts of the world was a good source to make an argument for China's sovereignty, right? How you become a sovereign nation in a new international order. So by sending their missions to Cuba and Peru, surveying the circumstances of their workers and making arguments that, these are our workers. We have our sovereign rights and we protect our workers. Those, I think, claims made it possible for the Qing government to claim claim a space for itself in the international arena. So workers created that space for them and their global presence in particular.
Okay, yeah, absolutely fascinating. So many, I have to hold myself back from wanting to follow up on various parts of this because there's so many interesting threads. But one, I also know actually probably both of interest to Yuming and myself, the clauses you mentioned in your talk in those treaties the Qing government was agreeing with the French on worker protections, and as you're discussing kind of how that was a key sovereignty enhancing measure. That's very, very, very interesting from an international law history perspective. But maybe we have time for one final question. So I'll give the floor to Michelle Ong, who has a question as well, I believe.
Hi, Zelda. Thank you for your talk. This was really interesting, and I really enjoyed reading your book. I was wondering if you could talk more about how you approached the French sources and how you went beyond the prejudices of the French officials to, I guess, reveal the voices of the Chinese laborers, especially when looking at the reports of the labor disputes and conflicts. And what sort of challenges did you have in examining those sources?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question for a historian because sometimes we write the history of people who did not produce anything about their own experiences. And in this case, I was writing about workers who did not create any information about themselves, about their own experiences. So everything I learned about them was coming from other sources, and it was definitely very difficult. So I remember, for example, I read so many things in the French archive, and everything was, of course, diplomatic negotiations and the correspondence between the railway company and French representatives, and they were always in conflict. By the way, I think that conflict was good because some French diplomats in China, they were very sympathetic to China and Chinese cause. So I think those diplomats helped me a lot because they were criticizing the company. I mean, some of these diplomats, I don't know why they were criticizing exactly. Sometimes you're not sure if it's a personal matter. But in many instances, they were criticizing the practices of the company because they were worried about French prestige in general. So they thought that the scandals during the construction were damaging the prestige of the French Empire. Especially diplomats were seeing themselves as representatives of this big project, right? That colonialism is such a big endeavor. So those conflicts inside the colonial machinery was helpful. But again, I remember for the first time, I went to British Library. I look for sources, and I found that journal piece. And it was a journal. It's a publication in French. And one of these recruiters created a narrative about a worker. So the story I use at the very beginning of the book, Li Chengfa's story, I've located in a publication from 1909 or something in the British Library. And it was for the first time that someone was talking about an individual worker. And I tell you, I was crying when I was reading that document because yes, there is this person with a name, a worker with a name. He has a family. Someone is talking about his family, his experiences. Maybe at that point I became a little creative or, tended toward creative fiction writing. I, of course, started to imagine his life, his experience, what type of difficulties he had. And again, all these legal cases, for example, helped me to, again, create some connection with individual workers. So I tried to imagine their world at that time, and it helped me. But still, I cannot say that this is this is not perfect. I cannot say that's a good story. I mean, when I go back to the book and read it, I still see it. Of course, yes, this dominance of that French narrative is still out there, but I think I did my best to find those, tiny narratives and put them out there to create some agency for Chinese workers.
So thanks so much, Professor Altan, for we're running up against the end of our time. So it just remains to me to say thanks so much for that incredibly rich talk, full of fascinating, important, largely, as you've noted, kind of forgotten historical details, but there's so much to dig into and follow up on. Such a great start for all of us to our Thursday mornings here. Thanks again to Professor Altan, and I hope everyone has an excellent day.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was great talking to you.